For nearly 6 centuries, Renaissance architect Alberti has been celebrated as an architect who transformed architecture into rational discipline. His buildings appear calm, balanced, mathematical, and timeless. His treatise on the art of building became one of the foundations of Western architectural theory, influencing everyone from Palladio to modern architects. But what if this familiar image of Alberti is incomplete? What if the father of classical architecture was also the first architect to undermine classical certainty? This is precisely the provocative argument made by Peter Eisenman. Rather than accepting Alberti as the architect who perfected order, Eisenman reads him as the architect who unknowingly introduced instability into architecture itself. His essay, Rewriting Alberti, is not simply an interpretation of Renaissance architecture. It is an attempt to rewrite architectural history. Today, we'll explore why one of architecture's most influential theories believed that Alberti was not the end of the architectural revolution, but its beginning. To understand this book, we first need to understand its author. Peter Eisenman emerged during the late 1960s as one of the most intellectually ambitious architects in America. Unlike many architects who became famous through buildings alone, Eisenman built his reputation equally through theory. He studied architecture at Cornell, Columbia, and then later completed a PhD at Cambridge, where he became interested in linguistics, philosophy, and structuralism. Throughout the 1970s, his famous House series, including House 1 through House 10, looked unlike conventional homes. Columns stopped before touching the ground, stairs led nowhere, walls intersected without obvious functional purpose. To many observers, these projects appeared irrational, but Eisenman insisted that they were deeply logical. Their logic simply did not originate from function. Instead, it emerged from architecture itself. Architecture, he argued, should no longer be understood merely as shelter or representation. It possessed its own internal language. By the 1980s, his work became increasingly influenced by French philosopher Jacques Derrida. Together, they explored the possibility that architecture, like language, contains internal contradictions. Buildings are not stable objects carrying fixed meanings. They are systems of relationships constantly open to reinterpretation. It is from this intellectual background that Rewriting Alberti emerged. So who was the Alberti? If Eisenman represents one of the architecture's most radical modern thinkers, Alberti represents one of its oldest heroes. Born in 1404, Alberti embodied the Renaissance ideal of the universal intellectual. He wrote about painting, he studied mathematics, he investigated archaeology, he composed literature, he designed churches and palaces. Most importantly, he wrote on the art of building, the first major architectural treatise since the Roman architect Vitruvius. Rather than describing construction techniques, Alberti attempted to define architecture itself. He argued the beauty emerged from harmony. Every part of the building should relate proportionally to every other part. Nothing could be added, nothing could be removed, without damaging the whole. These ideas became enormously influential. For centuries, Alberti has been presented as the architect who established architecture as a rational science. Yet Eisenman asks an unexpected question. What if these buildings are not as stable as it appears? So what is rewriting Alberti? At first glance, this book seems like another history essay, but it quickly becomes clear that Eisenman has little interest in conventional history. Traditional historians ask questions such as, what influenced Alberti? How were these buildings constructed? How did Renaissance politics shape his work? Eisenman asks something entirely different. How does architecture generate the meaning? And can that meaning ever overcome the stable? Every reading, Eisenman argues, inevitably rewrites its subject. History is never simply recovered. It is reconstructed. Architecture, therefore, resembles literature. Every generation interprets it differently. Every interpretation produces a new Alberti. Before Eisenman introduces his own interpretation, he first challenges the conventional one. Most architectural history treats Alberti as an architect of certainty. Perspective organizes the vision. Geometry organizes the space. Classical orders organize facades. Human proportions organize architecture. Everything appears coherent. Architecture becomes the visible expression of universal truths. This understanding dominated architectural education for centuries. Buildings represented timeless ideals. Architects discovered order rather than inventing it. But Eisenman argues that this view assumes meaning already exists before architecture begins. Architecture merely illustrates it. For him, this reduces architecture to representation. Its role becomes secondary. He asks instead, what if architecture doesn't merely represent order? What if it actually produces order? And what if the production is never complete? So this is where essay makes its most important shift. Eisenman argues that architecture should be read, not simply seen. The distinction sounds subtle, but it changes everything. Seeing happens immediately. Reading takes time. When reading a novel, meaning unfolds sentences by sentence. Interpretations change. Contradictions emerge. Earlier passages acquire new significance later. For Eisenman, architecture operates similarly. Buildings contain multiple layers, visible forms, hidden geometries, historical references, spatial sequences, structural systems. These layers rarely align perfectly. Instead, they interact like overlapping texts. Architecture, therefore, becomes less like sculpture and more like writing. This idea owes much to structuralism and literary theory. Meaning is never fixed. It emerges through relationships, not isolated objects. So here Eisenman identifies Alberti's greatest innovation. Ironically, it is also where architecture becomes unstable. In medieval architecture, structure and appearance largely coincided. Columns supported the roofs, walls enclosed the space. Construction explained itself. Alberti gradually separated these relationships. Columns increasingly became visual signs. Pilasters appeared without a structural necessity. Classical orders became ornamental systems. The facade became independent from construction. Architecture became representational. At first, this seems like a triumph. Buildings acquired greater freedom, but representation introduces a distance. Once architecture becomes a language, its signs can be interpreted differently. The relationship between object and meaning is no longer guaranteed. And architecture becomes readable and therefore rewritable. And now we jump onto the analysis of Santa Maria Novella by Alberti. This provides one of Eisenman's favorite examples. Most visitors admire its perfect symmetry, its wide marble geometry, its elegant proportions. But Eisenman looks elsewhere. He notices the compromises. The lower church already existed. The upper facade belonged to a different period. Alberti inherited incompatible conditions. Rather than erasing these inconsistencies, he negotiated them. The famous scrolls connecting neighboring aisles are not simply decorative ornaments. They reconcile incompatible geometries. The facade, therefore, appears unified. But unity emerges from conflict. Order is not discovered. It is constructed. For Eisenman, these moments reveal architecture thinking through contradiction. The next analysis is the Basilica of St. Andrea. This pushes the theory even further. The colossal triumph arch facade appears almost inevitable. Roman authority seems completely restored. Yet inside, the multiple geometries intersect. Different proportional systems overlap. The facade announces one spatial logic. The interior quietly introduces another. Instead of one unified system, we encounter several systems negotiating with one another. Eisenman sees these not as flaws, but as evidence that architecture contains internal multiplicity. Classical order is never singular, it is already layered. And the Derrida and the deconstruction. Many viewers have probably heard the word deconstruction. Usually it is associated with fragmented buildings, angular forms, broken geometries. But Jacques Derrida means something quite different. Deconstruction is not destruction. It is a careful reading. A deconstructive reading searches for internal tensions. Every apparently stable system contains contradictions. Every text undermines itself. Eisenman applies precisely this method to Alberti. He does not accuse Alberti of inconsistency. He celebrates it. Because these inconsistencies reveal something fundamental. Architecture never possesses complete certainty. Its appearance stability depends upon relationships that constantly shift. Alberti becomes important not because he solved architecture, but because his work demonstrates that architecture can never finally be solved. So why this matters for Eisenman's own work? And at this point, the essay turns back toward contemporary architecture. Eisenman's own buildings suddenly become easier to understand. The displayed grids, floating columns, fragmented geometries. These are not arbitrary forms. They are attempts to free architecture from representation. If Alberti separated structure from representation, Eisenman separates architecture from predetermined meaning altogether. Buildings no longer symbolize political power, religious authority, or historical continuity. Instead, they investigate architecture itself. This explains why Eisenman's projects often feel more like research than monuments. They ask questions rather than providing answers. So as a conclusion, what exactly does Peter Eisenman rewrite? Not Alberti's biography, Renaissance history. He writes the assumptions through which we have understood architecture for centuries. Instead of seeing Alberti as an architect who established a timeless certainty, Eisenman reveals an architect whose work already contains uncertainty. Representation separates itself from construction. Order emerges from contradiction. Meaning becomes unstable. Architecture begins behaving less like an object and more like a text. This may be Eisenman's most radical contribution. History is not something architects inherit unchanged. Every architect rewrites history. Every drawing and building and interpretation creates a different past. Perhaps Alberti himself will recognize this. After all, the Renaissance was never about copying antiquity. It was about reinventing it. And Peter Eisenman simply continues the tradition, not by copying Alberti, but by rewriting him. And the next time you stand before the Renaissance facade, don't ask whether it is beautiful. Ask instead, what contradictions are hidden beneath its perfect symmetry? Because for Peter Eisenman, those contradictions are where architecture truly begins. Thank you for watching. I hope this video helps you better understand the foundation of architectural thinking. We are still climbing the ladder of the knowledge in architecture, art, and design. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below.